welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host and my friend, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, thanks, Will.
Hey, and this week, our guest, who needs no introduction unless you're listening to it and you can't see, is Charlie Sykes. He is a conservative MSNBC contributor. He's also the author of several books, to include How the Right Lost Its Mind. Charlie Sykes was also the founder of the Bulwark, of which he is no longer a part of. And as he tweeted or sheeted, I'm not really quite sure what the right term is, he felt it was a good time to get off the daily hamster wheel of crazy. So welcome to the show, Charlie.
Hey, it is my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. So I want to kind of get right into sort of like kind of the hard hitting topics that all America cares about. And at the time that we're recording this, it is Holy Week. So I need to ask you: have you bought your $60 Trump Bible?
No, and I'm unlikely to. Actually, I have my own, but this is again one of these moments that feels like it's beyond parody. That you have somebody who has moved from peddling Trump steaks and Trump vodka and Trump sneakers to now actually commodifying the Bible during Holy Week.
Yeah.
It's one of those moments where you have to say, and I assume we're going to get more in depth into this, but you step back and you go, okay, how do people look at this figure and think that here we have a champion of Christian values? Here is God's anointed one. I find that as difficult to deal with as I did when it first became an issue back in 2016.
Well, Charlie, Isaiah 45 talked about Cyrus, and he was the 45th president. So I think that's all the evidence you need. It's all the evidence you need.
Well, for some people, apparently it is. But I think they've stretched the Cyrus analogies and the King David analogies really beyond the breaking point at this point. As he's hawking these Bibles for $60, because those legal fees don't pay themselves. So
They
there's
do
irony
not.
upon
They
irony.
do not.
They don't, which it's weird because like on the website of the individual selling it, it's like, yeah, like the proceeds won't go to Trump's campaign, but there's no mention about his legal funds. And I don't know too many billionaires that are hawking Bibles to raise money for whatever. I mean, maybe he's just way more altruistic than we give him credit for.
Yeah, that seems unlikely. Yeah, actually, I was speculating the other day that he's a billionaire and he wants America to turn back to God and pray more. He could be giving out Bibles. He could be he could be donating them as opposed to hawking them. But I think the one thing that is, and again, which irony do you want to deal with? The fact that he may use the sales of the Bibles to pay his legal fees for a criminal trial involving the fact that he had sex with a porn star and then had to pay her hush money. I mean, that's ironic in and of itself. The other irony, of course, is that this is a guy who I think probably has never actually read the Bible. And you'll notice that when he talks about prayer and faith, he never actually talks about what's in it or the content of it. Here's somebody who, if he was confronted with, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, would go, more left-wing propaganda. And I think that's one of the things, because I'm sorry to get ahead of myself here, but I've been talking about
Go
this
as far
for
ahead as you want.
Back in 2015, do you guys remember when he was, I had to look this up again, he was at the Family Leadership Summit in Iowa. And this was a serious organization with a lot of evangelicals in the room. And he was asked whether you have ever asked God for forgiveness. And he basically said, no, I never have. I've never asked God for forgiveness. And then he referred to communion as his little wine and little cracker. And at that moment, you go, okay, this guy, this guy has no idea, but his willingness to sort of exploit religious identity has become just so cynical over time. But I think we're beyond any expectation that this is a breaking point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like everything you're saying is a perfect plug for our fourth episode that we've had in our Heavenly Homeland series, where we've looked at sort of the connection to Trump and the evangelical community. And I want to play you just one quote from Trump that that he made back in 2015 to CBN, about one of his other favorite Bible quotes. So here it is.
The Bible. You talked about The Art of the Deal, great book. The Bible, even better. Why is that for you?
Well, there's so many things, like, you take whatever you want to say. There's so many things that you could learn from it. Proverbs, the chapter, never bend to envy. I've had that thing all of my life where people are bending to envy.
Gotta bend.
And it's an incredible book. So many things you can learn from the Bible, and you can lead your life. And I'm not just talking in terms of religion. I'm talking in terms of leading a life, even beyond a religion. There's so many.
So bend to envy. I don't know if you guys have that in your Bible. Yeah. Do you have that verse in yours, Charlie?
I'm going to defer to your knowledge of this, but this was new to me.
Okay, yeah. Breaking news. Yeah, I believe what I've been calling the Trump Bible is the NLT, the New Living Trump version, and where Jesus' words are all in orange. So that way they're easily identifiable. So yeah,
well, I mean, you remember that interview that he gave with Bloomberg, where they were essentially asking him, would you name your favorite Bible verse? And he repeatedly refused to do it. Said it's very, very personal. And they said, well, are you more Old Testament or New Testament? And he said, well, sort of evil. And you could just tell he was like, it's like watching a junior high kid who's giving a book report about a book they've never read before. And I think that's again and again. So this was all revived when he's hawking the Bible, the King James version, by the way, King James version of the Bible, apparently put together by the famous theologian Lee Greenwood, and it sort of reminded about just how deeply cynical this man is about religion, and also then how credulous so many of his supporters have been, and including the conservative evangelicals, obviously.
I just looked it up, and Proverbs does say, "Don't envy the wicked." That's one thing it says.
Well, that's a little bit on the nose, doesn't it?
A little bit, yeah. So kind of in other news, you work for a news network who just recently terminated an employee who I did the math. Ronna McDaniel, let's see, lasted about half a Scaramucci, about 4 days. Yeah. Not even a full Scaramucci. Yeah. What do you think about that? I mean, like, should people on news networks be, I don't know, canceled, for the lack of a better word, because of something they've said and or did, like, in the past?
Well, okay, let's talk about this. Is a little bit awkward, of course, because I am an MSNBC contributor. I'm not paid nearly as much as they were going to pay Ronna McDaniel. It was interesting what the reaction was, I think, among the anchors. And again, this was not because she was not fired, or there was not. The objections were not the fact that she was a Republican or that she was a conservative. This was not a right-left, Democrat-Republican issue. It was the fact that Ronna McDaniel had been a co-conspirator in the attempt to lie about the election and overturn the election, that she had engaged in the big lie, and that she had not only lied about the election, but that she continued to lie about the election when she appeared on Meet the Press. So the question is, what does it mean for a news outlet like NBC to essentially put this person on the payroll and then essentially say this is a credible source of information? I have no problem with them interviewing her or interviewing anybody else in the Trump orbit. It's when you say, you are now part of our team. What was the value added? What did Ronna McDaniel bring to NBC News they didn't have before? Why did they have to pay her to be a contributor? And I think that was the dividing line. So it's not about having Republican voices or conservative voices on the air, which I think they should have. I mean, I think they actually should have them. But the problem is, are there any consequences for attempting to overturn the election, for engaging in that kind of, deep attack on democracy, because if there is not a consequence for that, then in fact you're essentially saying that, this is within the normal parameters of American politics. And I think this is the challenge for all of us. I mean, this is the challenge for the culture, for the media and politics, that we treat the abnormal as normal. That what Donald Trump tried to do is so outside the norms of American politics, and that's putting it, mildly. The serial deceptions, the attempt to undermine the democracy. Is that just one more data point in our politics, or is it like, wait, there are red lights here? We have to understand that this is not acceptable behavior, that this in fact is something outrageous. And I think this is the challenge that we all face, that 2024 is not just liberal versus conservative. It's something fundamental, which is why then you have people like, for example, Mike Pence or Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger, who are deeply conservative individuals, saying, I may agree with him on politics, but this is just absolutely unacceptable. This is too dangerous. And so I think what the NBC executives did was they were going through this sort of normal process of, okay, so we, here's a flack for the president, or here's, the RNC chairman. Why not, put them on the payroll, without acknowledging that what happened and what she did, the role that she played, really should disqualify her from being treated as a credible source of information by any news outlet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, the explanation. I want to take us back a little bit to the past. In 2016, you interviewed Donald Trump on your radio program. I when I was doing some research for the podcast, or interview today, and just kind of, this idea that you didn't actually think that they would really call, and you were kind of surprised that this whole thing happened. But what really stuck out to me, and I'll get to my question here, but what really stuck out to me was that, like, I felt a lot of empathy, and well, maybe it's sympathy, for your position of being a contrarian, one, two, being a conservative, but feeling like this kind of conservative party has, and the Republican Party and this conservative movement has left you. And I kind of feel in many ways the same way. I'd love for you to kind of talk about that transformation and tie in what it was like to talk to Donald Trump, and how that, almost like that interview in that moment, was one of the other, like, notches in the belt that led you to the place of, yeah, this is, this party is kind of moving away from me. And if I'm getting that wrong, please correct me on that.
Well, no, I mean, it certainly was kind of a turning point. However, I was never Trump from the moment he came down the golden escalator. There was no transformation. And this was March 28th. I remember it very well, 2016. And I did not expect him to call in, because the previous 6 months I'd made it very, very clear that I was never Trump. And so when Hope Hicks called my producer and said, hey, Mr. Trump would like to come on the show, I just simply assumed that they would Google my name in about 10 seconds. It would come up that that he probably doesn't want to come on the show, what it's going to be like. So at 8:30 in the morning, when I began my show, I was surprised to see that little light up, and there he was. And our conversation was basically everything that I'd been thinking and saying for the last 6 months. Like, who are you? Why do you behave this way? The previous week he had insulted the looks of Ted Cruz's wife. And it was like, okay, you're running for the job that Abraham Lincoln once held. And why do you act like a 9-year-old on the playground? And then we went through the various issues. And I will say that he was a good sport about it. And at one point I said to him, Mr. Trump, do you understand that I am never Trump? And he said he did not know that. But he didn't hang up on me. But what struck me at the time was that I really did think I knew what it meant to be a conservative and what Republicans actually were looking for in a candidate. I did not think that they were going to embrace Donald Trump, and they didn't. He lost badly in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was an outlier. And I thought that we were going to be this firewall. Turned out we were just a speed bump. So that wasn't the moment that I thought the party was leaving. It was only later in the year, because most of the people who listened to me for the last 20 years, who had, voted for very conservative Republicans, up and down the line in Wisconsin, were not buying what Donald Trump was selling. But what we saw later in the year was this incredible tribalization, polarization of our politics, which I should have seen coming, the rallying around, the abandonment of all of the principled conservatives who we thought had represented what conservatism was. They were tossed out. The insults against, Charles Krauthammer and George Will, Paul Ryan was booed. And by the time of the convention, it became obvious to me that, wow, you understood who, at least a few months ago, you understood who and what Donald Trump represented, but now you're okay with it. And this was a very disillusioning, disappointing, and often very soul-crushing experience, watching one Republican and one conservative after another look at Donald Trump and say, yeah, I think this man has the character and the intellect and the principles to be president of the United States, if that's what they were saying.
Yeah, yeah, I'm very sympathetic to my conservative brethren. I mean, I'm a Democrat. Josh is a conservative, and I do feel bad because I know a lot of like conservative people and within sort of my friend circle, my family orbit, that are just like we can't even get measures and bills passed that are important to us because we're spending all of our time trying not to get Trump elected. And there was a really great quote from somebody we had in the program, Michael Ware, who was a spiritual advisor to Obama. And I'm totally probably gonna butcher this quote, but it was something along the lines of like, when people say that they feel politically homeless, that the real problem is that they actually chose to find a home in politics or something, and I'd love to kind of maybe get your sense of like where do conservatives go? I mean, I know a lot of conservatives are like, I am not voting for Biden, which I can appreciate that, but like if are you just going to stay home? What if there's other down ballot measures? Other sort of.
I'm one of those conservatives.
Yeah, so I love to get your take from your point of view as a conservative who's been a conservative for a long time, but not always, which would be my next question. But I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about that.
Well, that's a complicated question, but I've given a lot of thought to this because I know that there are some people who believe that, okay, so if you object to Trump, you need to become a Democrat, a liberal Democrat. And I understand, why people are making this argument. You have to vote for Joe Biden. But I do think that the voters who are going to determine this election, I think, are that group of center-right voters who are sort of on the bubble. They're still conservative. They have conservative values. They look at much of what's happening in the culture and they find it objectionable. So it's very hard for them to suddenly change their principles and their allegiances and vote for a Democrat, which is why I think the non-endorsement of Donald Trump by Mike Pence is an undercovered story. It's an underappreciated story because, I remember when Pence was chosen as vice president, it was a big thing for conservatives, mainstream conservatives, but particularly conservative evangelicals, because they knew where he was coming from, and he brought them into the fold. And what he's saying now is, I was there, I was loyal, I agreed with him politically, but this man is not fit. He's not a real conservative. Now, he's not going to vote for Joe Biden, but what he does is he provides that permission structure for conservatives to say, I am still a conservative, but that doesn't mean I need to vote for Donald Trump. Because I think our tribalized politics is so intense now, that sense that it's a binary choice, that if you're a conservative, it's either Biden or it's Trump. And if you don't agree with Joe Biden, if you do not agree with the Democrats, you must vote for Donald Trump. And you have these very, very prominent conservatives, Mike Pence is just one of them, saying, no, you don't need to go along with that. You can do something different. And we also have this extraordinary moment, which again, I think is not fully appreciated sometimes. I think that there's no historical precedent for the number of cabinet members and close aides to a president from the Secretary of Defense to the Attorney General to his National Security Advisor to his Chief of Staff, all of whom are saying, we were inside the room, we worked with this man, don't do it again. You look back on the Republican Party right now, of all of the presidential nominees and vice presidential nominees since in this century, the only one who is endorsing Donald Trump right now is Sarah Palin. Not the Bushes, not the Cheneys, not Mitt Romney, not Paul Ryan. So this says something that even though, someone like me, it feels like we're, completely in the wilderness and excommunicated and politically homeless, there are an awful lot of actual conservatives out there saying, don't fall into this trap of thinking that it is a binary choice. You don't need to embrace things that you find objectionable, but that doesn't mean you need to sign on to Trump. And I do think that we need to take that segment of the electorate more seriously.
Yeah. So, Charlie, one of the reasons I was really excited about talking to you is because, like, you have had a pretty impressive storied career. And, I want to kind of dig into that a little bit. So, today you're probably known as one of the most vocal critics of Trump. Mm-hmm. You're a wonderful voice to remind us that we're not the crazy ones, of which I appreciate. I need to hear that. I need to put it like on my thought wall or whatever,
Yes.
But you're definitely defined by a lot more than that. I'd love for you I'd love for you just to kind of talk to us a little bit more about how you got your start, and how you became a conservative. I mentioned earlier that you weren't always a conservative, so maybe you can kind of talk to us a little bit about, the history of origin story of Charlie Sykes.
Okay. Well, it's a long story. I'm going to try to make it a short story, and feel free to interrupt me, on this. I mean, I grew up in a liberal Democratic household. My father was chairman of the Wisconsin Civil Liberties Union. My first major political campaign was in 1968 when my father was the Wisconsin campaign manager for Eugene McCarthy, who was the Democratic senator from Minnesota, running as the anti-Vietnam War candidate against Lyndon Johnson. Wow. I became very active in Young Democrats. As in my high school years. But I think that ultimately the core values were that I was a classical liberal, but also a contrarian, which is that being from a journalistic background, I was always skeptical, always asking questions. And I became a newspaper reporter covering urban issues. And I'll make this, noticing that, well, wait, these things don't work. They may have good intentions, but they have disastrous consequences. And in the 70s, I thought, and this seems ironic now, that the conservative writers were the ones who were the most intellectually interesting. They were willing to ask questions. They were willing to challenge these orthodoxies. And I thought liberalism had become sclerotic. It had become rather smug. And disconnected with a lot of the, I think concerns that that Americans have. So I became more and more skeptical of liberal dogma, and began to, ask some of these questions. And people say, well, you're becoming a right winger. You're becoming a conservative. And I remember thinking, I don't care what you call me. Maybe I am. And so over time, I think I became more comfortable. Now, this all took a terribly wrong turn, I'm afraid, because, as our politics became more polarized, particularly when I, by the way, just before we get into the talk radio world, I mean, I've written 9 books, in-depth books about education reform, higher education, our culture of victimization. I wrote a book about the right of privacy. But when I became,
you even wrote a book where the foreword was by William Buckley.
Yes, the National Review College Guide at one time, and I really admired people like William F. Buckley just tremendously. I mean, for me, as a young person trying to figure out, who do I want to emulate? Somebody with that kind of intelligence and that kind of eloquence, and I was really attracted to that. So I came into the conservative movement actually thinking that it was a set of ideas, very, very provocative ideas, and as opposed to the and again, so I come in as somebody that did not grow up as a conservative in the Goldwater era or anything. So I came in a different way. So what happened later to the conservative movement, I think probably took me by, well, very much took me by surprise, which it shouldn't have. But when I became part of a talk radio, in the beginning, I thought we were just simply presenting the other side of the story, that we were providing a different point of view. As we know, that morphed into an echo chamber, a bubble, an alternative reality silo over the years. It also became more hyper-partisan and tribal, and I became part of that. And I look back on that with tremendous regret because and I think this is one of the things that's happened to our culture, is that it becomes, the fight becomes about the fight. And I believed everything that I was saying, but at a certain point, you begin to think of yourself as the tip of the spear rather than as a thoughtful purveyor of ideas and principles. And I look back on that with a great deal of regret. But it also provided me with an understanding of kind of what happened, this transformation of the conservative movement, which Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think, once suggested, the Republicans had become the party of ideas. Does anybody say that anymore? So how did we go from William F. Buckley Jr. to Sarah Palin? How did we go from George Will to Tucker Carlson? How do you go from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump? These are not obvious transitions, at least to me.
Yeah, I would love to dig into that a little bit more, because I remember so I voted for Trump in 2016, and I remember waking up in the morning and looking at the results and seeing that he won and being very surprised. And all of this, all of this stuff was coming out that basically, that either the liberal media, and that's a lot of what I read, right, was conservative stuff. So like the liberal media missed it, or they basically they didn't take into account flyover country. They didn't really see how people were really feeling. They missed it. Brexit, different things around the world where these now more conservative movements, like that people were feeling differently. And you kind of alluded to like that the conservatives in the past were kind of tapping into something where maybe the common man felt something, or there was a movement there that attracted them and things like that. And these ideas that were fundamental was what was so attractive. What were some of the shifts that happened? And you've said a couple times, I should have known. What do you mean when you say that you should have known, you should have seen it, you should have understood it before? Like, looking back in retrospect, because everything's easier in retrospect to see, right? So what were those things where you're like, at that time, that should have been the signal to me that things were shifting and that I needed to, shift my own thinking and activity?
Well, it was really, really only in late 2016 that I began to realize, the things had gone so far off the rail. Look, we'd always known that there were the extremists, the crazy uncles, in the room. But I always believed that the center would hold. And one of the things that I did over the years was I would push back against what I thought were the crackpots, the people who were pushing crazy ideas, because I was one of those who said, okay, the left says that we are these, ignorant redneck racists, reactionaries, and let's prove to them that they're wrong. And then, of course, 2016 comes along, and it's like, wait, you've taken every caricature that the left has of them, and you've embraced it. Like, no, we really are like that. So, I mean, look, I knew that there were the people who supported Pat Buchanan. I knew that there were the Ron Pauls, populist isolationists out there. But I always thought that ultimately the common sense would prevail. And afterwards, I remember very shortly after the 2016 election, and I was talking with George Will on my radio show, who I admire tremendously, do to this day. And he was mentioning, I think our fundamental mistake was that we thought that the intellectual conservatives, the people who wrote for National Review and everything at that time, were, that was the conservative movement. But actually, this was this thin pie crust on top of this molten populist base that we did not understand, and that even though it was for years, we could appeal to the better angels, like, no, you don't really believe that Barack Obama was born in Kenya. That's not the point. You can disagree with him on tax policy, but don't go that way. We thought that was effective. It turns out that's what the public wanted. The Tea Party, I think, probably should have been a little bit of a warning sign in this respect. In the beginning, I think it had all the marks of a genuine grassroots movement, but quickly morphed into what we've seen as the pattern, became taken over by extremists, by grifters, and, it took on kind of an ugly tone. But again, I always thought, and really up through 2016, that did not represent where the party was going to go. And even when Trump was elected, I thought that there would still be a very powerful remnant of the conservative movement that say, okay, we'll go along with you on tax cuts and judges, but we're going to draw the line here. We actually do think that character matters. And that collapse was shocking, and it continues to be shocking. And you can even see, like, even right now, even within the last few months, if you listen carefully to people like Mike Pence or Nikki Haley, or even Ron DeSantis, they are genuinely shocked by how thoroughly the Republican Party has been transformed, how it's become a cult of personality. Donald Trump did not change to get to adjust to what the Republican Party was. The Republican Party has completely remade itself, including evangelicals who went from being the group that, said, yes, character matters the most, to being the demographic group that says that personal character mattered the least when it came to electing a candidate. So some of that was a pre-existing condition. The dysfunction was a pre-existing condition, but I certainly did not understand the degree to which these principles were contingent. They were prepared to drop them. On the other hand, to your point, I think that we underestimated some of the. I really did underestimate the capacity of conservatives to tolerate racism and anti-Semitism and a variety of other things. I'm not one of those who say everybody was racist all the time, but there's no question about it that their willingness to tolerate it is extraordinary. I thought we had reached a point where it was like, okay, we've moved past that. And I think that's been one of the kind of the really shocking revelations of the last few years.
Yeah, when Trump was elected, I remember having a conversation with my wife, and sort of equating kind of his rise as like the Frankenstein monster, that he was sort of created in sort of this like environment where, like folks like Roger Stone and Alex Jones and whatnot are become mainstream. And like when you think about sort of the Frankenstein analogy, like he wasn't created singularly by himself. Like Dr. Frankenstein needed components, right, to kind of create the contraption or the device, and ultimately he pulled the lever, right? But like he had to sort of source out parts and materials to create this thing. And you've mentioned a few times that you felt like you may have contributed in some way, small or big, to sort of like the rise of Trump. And I'd love to maybe just get your thoughts on like what specifically do you think you've done to have contributed, and maybe what advice would you have for other radio show people or network television broadcasters?
Well, there's no question about it that Trump was really a creature of conservative talk radio and of the new conservative media. Now, Fox News resisted him for a little while, but then caved in. Rush Limbaugh caved in very, very early. part of the story, my backstory is that in Wisconsin, conservative talk radio was very anti-Trump and succeeded in blocking him. So none of that was necessarily inevitable. But to your specific question, and this goes back, I think, to one of the developments. I mean, I was on talk radio for 23 years. So, in the beginning, we had people from both political parties on. We had debates. I was a conservative, but this was a discussion of the issues. And often what I thought was the strongest was, okay, well, here's a serious discussion of this policy issue. One of my big issues in Wisconsin and Milwaukee was urban school choice, which I still think was a good idea. But as time went on, particularly as you got into like the 2010s, it became much more partisan, much more tribal. We had a big fight here in Wisconsin over Act 10. This was, Scott Walker becomes the governor, and they pushed through legislation that limited public employee union rights. At a certain point, that no longer became about public employee unionism. It became about us versus them. And it became incredibly polarizing, incredibly emotional, incredibly take no prisoners. And as I look back on what happened later, what I think we missed was that the tribalization, the polarization, the us versus them, that we have to win so that you lose, became the dominant ethos. And that explains the Republican Party's embrace of Trump. So that I simply assumed that conservatives would look at Trump, and even when he got the nomination, and go, yeah, no, that's not what we believe. We're not going along with that. I mean, we can talk about the baggage that Hillary Clinton had, which was unique and which Democrats did not fully appreciate at the time. But what I didn't fully appreciate was that the fact is that we had changed politics from being about ideas into being a team sport. And I think that we're seeing that. And I think, did contribute to that polarization. And so when I tried to sort of stand athwart all of this and say, yes, but not Trump. You're not going to go along with this. This is not what conservatives believe. This is, we're not going to build a wall along the border. This is not, what is this about? That sort of thing. It was already too late at that point. Plus, the other big change happened with misinformation and disinformation. For decades, I'd been able to push back against that and say, okay, so you have a story about, dead bodies in a warehouse, and here's the actual fact check on this, and you don't want to, pass on things that are, BS. By late 2016, people were saying, well, no, before that, people would say, well, thank you. I'm not going to forward Uncle Otto's email anymore. By 2016, you couldn't refute the disinformation because nothing that came from the liberal media was believed. This was the siloing. And that was, okay, I had been critical of the mainstream media for years, and then realized at a certain point, we had succeeded not in making them better or more balanced, we had succeeded in discrediting them completely. So all the guardrails were gone, and the immune system of the conservative movement to bad information had been destroyed.
Wow. That is absolutely fascinating. And it makes me think about I'm an evangelical. So it makes me think about the role of faith, the role of evangelicalism and all of this. I'm also a Pentecostal by heritage and by theology. And Pentecostals have been at the center of this, charismatics, and the center of this kind of, I'm sure you've heard of, but things like the New Apostolic Reformation, which we've talked a lot about, things like the Seven-Mountain Mandate that we've talked about a lot about, this equation of Cyrus or Trump. This is all coming out of the Pentecostal charismatic leaders and movements, and it makes me nervous. It hurts me in a lot of ways in my heart, because I don't like that kind of talk. I think it's like talking about the guardrails of good exegesis, the guardrails of good hermeneutics have been taken off. And we've had a lot of conservative, theologians, Bible scholars, people that are getting published by Zondervan, Erdman's, Baker. These are not an
Serious
argument
people.
can maybe be made. But yeah, these are not like liberal, like, these are people. These are really mainstream, good, solid people like Tremper Longman. We've talked to him several times. He's a very well-known Old Testament scholar, and we've asked him these questions. He's like, people have just abandoned exegesis. He's also very vocal about everything that's happening with Trump and Christian nationalism in particular. And we had the pleasure of having Dan Partland on the show before, with the director of God and Country, and we know you're
I'm on
in that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was great documentary, and really appreciated your part in it. But I would love for you to kind of talk about this from what you've seen, your perspective, this wedding of faith in power, faith in politics. I mean, religion and politics have always been around. We cannot, anyone who understands history knows that. They've seen that. The separation has never really worked all that well. That's always been there to some degree. But how concerning is it to you, this Christian nationalism in our current moment? And how do you see that we've gotten here from your perspective, from what you understand in your time in conservative talk radio?
Well, let me take two different approaches to that, because you're
Please.
right. Now, so as somebody who was raised in a very secular environment, my father was Jewish, my mother was I would say non-practicing Methodist, and I converted in my youth. One of the writers that was most influential for me was C.S. Lewis. I believe I've read every single book
Absolutely.
that he ever wrote. But again, this was part of this period in my life where I was searching out the people who were the most interesting and serious thinkers. And C.S. Lewis introduced me to a Christian theology with real depth and nuance and intelligence. And so this is also part of the, watching the abandonment of that serious approach to theology. And I have very little to add to what Dan Partland has told you, or what Tim Alberta has told you about what's been happening to the church. I mean, when I was doing my podcast, I had Peter Weiner on a regular basis. I had David French on, and we dealt with this and tried to get our heads around, from the point of view of people of faith, what is happening to all of this. And I have to say, this remains one of the most difficult things for me to really understand. And it helps to know that people who are much more knowledgeable than I am are still having a hard time coping with this and understanding this. Okay. So
yes, it does.
yeah, I mean, it is really difficult. And I think it is a real crisis for the church writ large, because you have many Christians who are thinking, okay, this is not my understanding of Christianity. This seems more this seems more cult-like, but also seems an abandonment of the content of our faith, as opposed to the using Christianity and Christian identity as a cudgel. And so there's a huge price to be paid by the church for putting political power ahead of faith. I mean, in many ways, it's a means to an end. I mean, I understand that they believe that what they're doing in politics is a means to an end, but at what cost? What profits it you to gain the whole world if you lose your soul? So there is that. But let me give you the flip side of this as well, because I remember talking about this extensively in 2016, and I think it's something that people on the left have been slow to understand, because the reality is, and let's go back to 2016, what I saw happening right there. You had many Christians who felt that they were under siege, that they were under attack, that they were being disrespected. And some of that was exaggerated, but it was not totally. I mean, there are people who, in fact, do have contempt for religion. There are secularists who do not respect people of conscience. And one of the issues that I remember talking about, both publicly and privately, at the time was, I was telling somebody, well, why are evangelicals, abandoning the Democratic Party? And I said, well, I do think that
Mm.
you need to have more of an appreciation for the very specific issue of religious freedom and religious conscience. Because and even now, I think this is a vulnerable area, that if you do not have respect for people who do not want to be required to perform abortions, or people who have different views about same-sex marriage, if you are not willing to tolerate them, then you are going to push them into the opposition. And so I think there was an issue of respect versus contempt. There was also the issue of whether or not we were going to respect religious freedom. So issues like, and I don't have them, what were some of the cases that went up? I remember the Little Sisters of, there was an issue involving
Yep.
Obamacare.
In Massachusetts.
And these issues became very big on the right, that you're forcing people
Yes.
to do something. And I remember I used to have a television show in Milwaukee, and would have the Archbishop, now Cardinal Dolan, on, who was deeply popular man, but man of faith. And he told me very bluntly that if the federal government required Catholic hospitals to perform abortions, they would just shut them down. They would just shut them all down. And he realized, okay,
Yeah.
we can live in a society, and again, this is what a liberal democracy is, where you tolerate and respect different points of view. You don't need to adopt them. And I'm not sure that the left has always respected that, and I'm putting that very, very mildly. And so I do think that the sense that religious freedom and religious liberty were under siege was a huge factor behind what we're describing here, the polarization of evangelicals. Because once you convince them that they're coming for you, they hate you, they are going to force their values on you, and they really don't respect your conscience on these issues, you are going to get resistance and a backlash. And we have seen that rather dramatically. And I do remember making this point over and over again. And I'm not sure that it's has been fully taken on board even to this day.
That is so incisive. I know Will's got a question. I'm going to let him go, but I just wanted to say, you hit the nail on the head, because for me, the reason I voted for Trump in 2016 was religious freedom.
Yep.
And I thought he was the only candidate who cared about it for me.
Right.
Now, was I right or wrong? I don't know. I guess now we're seeing in hindsight all the consequences, but that was exactly the reason that I did, and my wife and all the other conservative Christians I know.
Yeah, there's a really good book I can't recommend enough. Actually, by the person that Josh has mentioned, Trimper Longman. He wrote a book called The Bible and the Ballot, which is phenomenal book. It sort of talks about it addresses some of the major issues that people see in the media and how we should really view them from a Christian perspective. And there's a section in there about Christians feeling like they're being persecuted. And I'll just give you the quick summary. He's like, yeah, that's biblical. But basically in the book is you're going to be persecuted, so just that's what you signed up for. And I want to kind of continue this thread of Christian nationalism in the media, and how should journalists approach this? Because there are some really, really great reporters that sort of cover this space. There's Catherine Stewart from the New Republic, or Brian Kaler from Word and Way. But on MSNBC, it was Heidi Presbala, I think that's how you say her name, made a comment. And it sort of it just sort of further kind of added more gasoline to the libs don't really want us to believe in God or whatnot. So how should we cover this?
Okay, well, first of all, that was a big deal, and really, really unfortunate. I do think that one of the problems when we talk about the diversity, we need more diversity, and diversity of ideas, diversity of religious ideas would help tremendously, because in my experience, both in academia and in the media, Christians are significantly underrepresented, and as a result, you have lots of secular progressives who really just don't understand, who are completely unfamiliar with Christian ideas and Christian doctrine. I mean, it's completely alien to them. I mean, I remember there's a famous story going back to the early 1990s, probably before your time, where the Washington Post had a front page article about who are these evangelical Christians. And I think it said something like, they're basically, uneducated, easily led. And it was one stereotype after another. And afterwards, people said, well, how did that get through the editing desk? How did you write something that was that offensive about that, a group of Americans? You can't imagine writing that about Muslims or about Jews or about any ethnic minority or any group. Why would you write something like that was that offensive? And I think the answer was, and I've written about this, was there was probably nobody in the editing process who was an evangelical Christian or was particularly well informed about evangelical Christians. I mean, it was a completely different world. So let's fast forward to the debate about Christian nationalism, which is, as Josh points out, is a very legitimate issue. But in order to really understand it, you have to understand the relationship of Christian nationalism to biblical Christianity, to other forms of Christianity. And I will say this as a contributor to MSNBC, sometimes these arguments, in the liberal media do show a complete lack of appreciation for and understanding of those distinctions, which are important. So that leads to that incident you're describing. And by the way, I know Heidi, and she's great. She's a good reporter. And this was really unfortunate. I don't know what happened, but let's just leave the personalities out of it. There was this discussion about what is Christian nationalism? And, it comes up, well, if you believe that your rights come from God rather than from, the Constitution, that's a sign of Christian nationalism. And anybody that saw them went, wait, that's not the definition. This is something that Christians and frankly, even non-Christian Americans like Thomas Jefferson have been talking about for a very long time. So there was a level of insensitivity and lack of knowledge that was really shocking. And so when the media talks about this, they have to find a way to be respectful of Christians. And I think that this is something that people pick up on. I mean, you're familiar with Arthur Brooks, who used to be, who's written very extensive, and he has a great insight where he talks about the dangers of contempt in political debate. That the moment when you roll your eyes and show contempt for somebody, the conversation's over. If you think that I have contempt for you, you're not going to be that interested in hearing my ideas about Social Security reform or foreign policy or education reform. You're thinking this is somebody who looks down on me, and it's over. And I think this is a real problem in talking about any of these issues involving Christianity, because there is a distinction. Christian nationalism is something, separate from belief that our rights come from God rather than from the government. I mean, and I didn't even know how they made that mistake. But unfortunately, this is what happens in an environment where you have a lack of diversity and respect for ideas, including Christian ideas.
That makes a lot of sense. And getting that, defining Christian nationalism vis-a-vis evangelical Christianity, vis-a-vis other kinds of Christianity, is going to be super important, I think, as we move into the future. And that idea, what do you think, where do you see the future of conservative politics and even the role of critique within, like having our own immune system? I love that idea. Where do you see if conservative politics going, and how do we reinvigorate this immune system within it?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know. It's hard to see past the moment we're in right now, because I think things are going to get worse because we've become more siloed. We have become all the incentive structure in communication has been to the extreme voices, and it's very hard to find a forum where you can have this intelligent, distinction, like on Christian nationalism. It is this, but it is not this, which is really important. In fact, those distinctions have just come up again and again. It's like, okay, George Will is not Tucker Carlson. William F. Buckley is not Ann Coulter. These are important to understand this. So what is the internal critique of conservatism? Right now, I feel like there's almost a suspension of serious discussion of ideas. It has all the oxygen has been sucked out by, are you pro-Trump or anti-Trump? Do you believe, in the big lie, or you do not believe in the big lie? And so there is work being done, but it's very much in the shadows right now. And so early on after Trump was elected, I gave a lot of interviews where I said there's going to be a big rethinking of conservative values, and I was assuming that at some point this would pass and that we would begin seriously discussing it. That is not really happening now. Again, people will push back and say, well, what about this think tank or that think tank? Well, that doesn't represent really what's going on with the conservative movement at this point. But the pieces are going to have to be picked up. There's not going to be a return to Reaganism. There's going to have to be a new fusionism. But this is not going to be over anytime soon. And unfortunately, the voices that are critiquing where conservatism, is going right now, tend to be to risk excommunication.
Yeah.
And again, to circle back to the Mike Pences and the Liz Cheneys. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but to suggest that they are not actual conservatives is ridiculous. To suggest that somebody like a David French or a Peter Weiner are not real conservatives. Russell Moore is a conservative Christian, and yet is demonized by MAGA because he's not willing to go along with Trump.
Yes.
So in some ways, you have to wait for the storm to break.
Yeah, so my last question for you, and this has been great, by the way. Like, I just really enjoy just hearing what you have to say. We sort of pride ourselves on this podcast as just being able to talk to a bunch of diverse group of people. I mean, like, we've had the first transgender bishop on our show. We've also had the co-founder of the Satanic Temple, and the like founder of the Reawaken tour. So that gives
President of the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, and a whole bunch in between, obviously. Yeah. So if that gives you any sense of sort of the audience and demographic that we're trying to reach, and with that in mind, I'd love for you to maybe give us your thoughts on what hope do you have for the future of America? Because I feel like there's a lot that people. No, there's a lot for people to not be hopeful for, but there is some stuff that people can be hopeful for. Like when we asked this question to Tim Alberta, and he was like, "Hey, the young people are the ones that give me a lot of hope," and he kind of expanded on the reason why. So what is it that gives Charlie Sykes hope for the future of America?
Well, I have a lot that's not hopeful, but I agree with Tim, and I think part of it is that there's a fundamental decency of the American people that you notice anytime you get off social media and you go out into the world. You come out of your basement and you talk to people. You go to soccer games, you go to Little League games, and people are not talking about politics. And it is remarkable to me. The moment you step out of politics, you realize that we have so much more in common. I mean, this is why I think you quoted somebody as saying, don't make politics your identity, because once you begin talking about that, you have the divisions. Whereas if you leave out the top line and even talk about ideas, like, even have a discussion about, what should our policy be on infrastructure? Let's not talk about Trump or Biden and everything. You'll find that people want to solve problems, want to go through it. So what you hope for is that the vast majority of Americans who are not the rabid partisans, they're now the exhausted Americans, that the exhausted Americans will not give up on politics, but will exert some sort of influence. Like, okay, guys, aren't we tired of crapping on each other all the time? Aren't we tired of this? Because there's something exhausting about keeping the emotional intensity up all the time. You can't do it. So there is this, and I know it's a cliche in politics, the silent majority or the vast middle. I think they're under siege, but they're still there. So I think in terms of the hope, look to the younger generation, but also look to your neighbors who are not necessarily glued to Truth Social or to cable television. I would certainly suggest to people the less politics they consume, and this is my business, by the way, but the less politics they consume, the better they are, and the more likely it is that they will be able to retain their sanity. Because, part of this, my message that you are not the crazy ones is, don't inject this stuff into your veins all the time. Life is bigger. Life is better than this.
That's wonderful, and I think it's a great way to kind of end the show. Well, for people that don't know who you are, how can people follow you? For those that want to get their sort of post Bulwark fix in their veins, how can folks follow you and just read what you're up to?
Well, I'm still on whatever Twitter is called these days, at Sykes Charlie. I'm also on Threads, and I am writing for a variety of other publications, and hopefully will be able to put together a book that makes some sense of our times, a post-Trump book about what's happening to our culture. But that is, as they say, a work in progress.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Charlie Sykes. This has been a phenomenal interview.
Yes, thank you.
Good luck to just everything that you're doing, and we just really appreciate just like what you've contributed to America. So
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
And to our listeners and watchers, thanks for tuning in. And as always, keep your conversations not right, not left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.